Happy American Constitution Day. Let's talk about the time when Joseph Smith and his Mormon apostles and followers proposed a replacement to the US Constitution because they believed it was a failed political document. Today is Constitution Day within the United States, a day set aside for Americans to reflect and commemorate and often celebrate the US Constitution and its legacies. And few Americans are more well known for celebrating their American patriotism as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who have gone a far way towards sacralizing the document, enshrining this idea of a Christian nation origins and saying that the Constitution was inspired. But with that, it may be surprising to learn that Joseph Smith, the founding prophet of the LDS tradition, actually worked toward replacing the US Constitution because he saw the Constitution having fundamental flaws that could only be corrected through a theocratic constitution within his secretive Council of 50. Here it is. Here's the proposed Constitution that was written primarily by Parley P. Pratt, an LDS apostle, and presented to the LDS Council of 50 in April of 1844, just a couple months before Joseph Smith's death. So, I want to take this video and quickly talk about that Constitution, its backgrounds, its origins, its context, as well as some of the lasting legacies. Let's dig in. But first, we need a bit of context. The Constitution was less than 2 decades old when Joseph Smith was born in 1805. In other words, it was the law of the land, but it was still a far ways away from being embedded within American culture. Many still saw democracy in general, and the constitutional government in existence, as an experiment. It would not be fully sacralized and seen as this enshrined document until decades later, often over the disputes over slavery that centered these debates over constitutional rights. But maybe that's a topic for another video. And even at that time, in the early 1800s, many religious figures, what we might now call evangelicals in their outlook and fervent belief, actually critiqued the US Constitution for being too secular. The US Constitution was one of the first founding documents for nations that did not directly reference a god or divine providence. And that made many religionists uneasy. Put a pin on that later because that's going to become significant. So Joseph Smith and early Latter-day Saints were raised in a community that thought very highly of the Constitution, but were also willing to critique it. Now, lots of scholars have looked into Joseph Smith's early teachings and revelations and scriptural texts to understand their political context. I'll give you some references at the end for some great scholars if you want to learn to read, if you want to learn more on it. But most have argued that Joseph Smith's earliest revelations, so 1829 through early 1833, kind of existed within this religious sphere that ignored the American confines that surrounded them. They kind of assumed, like many millenarian religious groups at the time, that they would outlive the United States and perform a religious organization, inaugurate a Christian kingdom that would transcend America and bridge into the millennium. Another principle that's going to become relevant later. But the Latter-day Saint crisis in Missouri, starting in 1833, brought constitutional principles to the foreground of LDS discussions and even made their way in the revelations that Joseph Smith was dictating. First, in a revelation he dictated in August 1833, now known as D&C 98. Here you see it on the Joseph Smith Papers website, with the relevant portion even in Joseph Smith's own hand, which is very rare for Joseph Smith documents, in which it says, "I say unto you concerning the laws of the land, it is my will that my people should observe it to do all things whatsoever I command them." Now, pause for a moment and just note this is the first reference in the LDS Church to emphasize following the laws, that you are going to exist as citizens within a constitutional order. So I think that's noteworthy. Then going on. And that law of the land, which is constitutional, supporting that principle of freedom and maintaining rights and privileges, belongs to all mankind and is justifiable before me. Therefore, I, the Lord, justify you and your brethren of my church in befriending that law, which is the constitution of the law of that land. So clearly a reference to using the Constitution in their favors, befriending that constitutional order. This in many ways is the origins of the LDS Church sacralizing the Constitution, something that is going to be escalated later on, because as the Latter-day Saints are kicked out of Jackson County, Missouri through disputes throughout the year of 1833, resulting in a number of clashes between Latter-day Saints and the state of Missouri, Joseph Smith dictates another revelation in December of 1833, now known as D&C 101, which includes this clause, again from the Joseph Smith Papers website. For this purpose, I have established the constitution of this land by the hands of wise men, whom I raised up unto this very purpose, and redeemed the land by the shedding of blood. In other words, here we get in Joseph Smith's own revelatory teachings the idea that there are divinely sanctioned and inspired constitutional principles, that the Constitution was meant to save them. Now, these verses have been highlighted and interpreted in different ways throughout Latter-day Saint history ever since. Maybe in a future video, I'll talk about how in the 20th century, those verses come to serve as a foundation for a Mormon Christian nationalism led by Cleon Skousen, Ezra Benson, and others that in many ways sacralize the Constitution even beyond what you might find among non-Mormon American Christians. And there is a lot of diversity within how Latter-day Saints have interpreted those verses. Some saying the entirety of the Constitution was inspired, some saying it's only the matters of religious freedom and that it's a more limited interpretation. Again, out of the scope of my video here. The main lessons I want to take for the origins toward Joseph Smith's own Constitution is that he seems to be framing the Constitution as a protection for religious rights and the rights of people against the oppression of mobs and mobocracy, and that the battles of Missouri further refine how Joseph Smith and others view constitutional rights, especially those in minority positions, which the Latter-day Saints understood themselves to be. Before I go any further, let me remind you that if you enjoy this type of historical nerdy content, make sure you are subscribed to this channel, like and share the video so we can broaden the discussion. And if you want to find a way to give back, please consider becoming a member of the channel, which comes with a few perks like early access to the videos and icons next to the name. So when I'm glancing through the hundreds of comments, I know who to respond to. All right, I apologize again for the awkward pitch. Let's get back to the history. The disputes that took place in Nauvoo both exasperated Joseph Smith's and the Saints' distrust of majoritarian cultures, as well as challenged their commitment to constitutional principles, being able to police those types of crises. Now, I've already done a previous video on Joseph Smith's political ambitions, his presidential campaign, and his political views. Here you see here in his military regalia an image that often reflected in the LDS context his significance for the community, and to the non-LDS community his drive for more power and control. But what's important for this video and the origins of the Constitution are Joseph Smith's political views, in which he came to believe that the existing political structure was insufficient to protect the rights of groups like Latter-day Saints. In other words, Joseph Smith believed that the contemporary constitutional interpretation in the nation was too weak, that politicians only did what they could to be elected by majority opinion, the federal government was too weak or uninterested in intervening into local matters, and that, importantly, and this is what comes to the foreground in Nauvoo, the government did not prioritize divine laws as the root of society, even over democratic opinion. So in 1843, after Joseph Smith and the Mormons had burned a lot of bridges with political parties in the state of Illinois, and they were having to look elsewhere to find political salvation, Joseph Smith wrote letters to the 5 leading presidential candidates, and he had a back and forth with a few of them. None of these back and forths were more revealing and important for this story than his discussion with John C. Calhoun, the South Carolina senator, the architect of states' rights doctrine and white supremacy and seeing slavery as a pro-good. And when Joseph Smith wrote John C. Calhoun and said, "If you are elected president, what would you do to help the Mormons?" And John C. Calhoun says, "That's a state matter. That's not the federal government." Joseph Smith responded to Calhoun and said that is a weak and fraudulent interpretation of how the government should work, including of the Constitution, that Congress and the president should be as powerful in their sphere as Jehovah, God, is powerful in his sphere. In other words, a government has to have the power to intervene. And so therefore, either the American Constitution is too weak, or Calhoun and others' interpretation of the Constitution is too weak. Joseph Smith eventually, of course, declares his own presidential ambitions, launches his own campaign, and in his presidential tract, here you see the cover image, he called for restoring constitutional principles and expanding federal power. Examples of which are taking federal power to annex Texas, sell land, as well as creating a national bank and abolishing debtors' prisons. Things that showed a very large and optimistic view for federal power being wielded as an activist government. Now, privately, at this very same time, Joseph Smith is pushing even more radical actions, showing that his critique is not just about how the Constitution is being wielded, but principles of the Constitution itself. Before I get to those actual facts of what Joseph Smith was pushing for in private with the Council of 50 and new Constitution, I do want to at least reference the rumors that seem relevant here of the White Horse prophecy. These much later reminiscences in which Joseph Smith is alleged to tell several people that there will come a day when the Constitution hangs by a string and the Mormon elders will come out and save it. And he tells us by this grand allegory of seeing different horses. I may do a video at some point explicitly on the White Horse prophecy. Let me emphasize that there's no contemporary records that refer to this prophecy of the United States eventually falling and the Mormon apostles coming to save them, coming directly from Joseph Smith. Instead, I think the White Horse prophecy is this fascinating folkloric tale, this creation of a cultural myth that ends up vindicating later Mormon political theologies and trying to justify them by placing them back on Joseph Smith. But that's a divergence. Let's get back to the actual history. In March of 1844, due to swirling crises outside the church and disputes within the church, Joseph Smith organizes with some of his closest followers the Council of 50, a theocratic organization, a world government in embryo that was meant to oversee the church's potential move outside of Nauvoo, organize Joseph Smith's presidential run, replace other institutions in Nauvoo that Joseph Smith had lost faith in due to dissent, as well as create, again, a government in embryo that eventually usher in the millennial kingdom. Luckily, the Council of 50 kept detailed notes. Here are the notebooks that William Clayton as scribe kept. I will do a video in the future specifically on the Council of 50, but one of the first things that the Council of 50 was assigned to do was to write a new constitution. And this was because not just they were a new organization, but in the words of Joseph Smith, all existing governments, including existing constitutions, featured a fatal flaw, according to Joseph Smith. And that fatal flaw was that they did not recognize God's law. So I want to emphasize the Joseph Smith critique was not just that American politicians were misreading or misapplying the Constitution, but that the Constitution itself had a flaw in it, was that it was based on human majority vote and democracy rather than theocratic rule of God's teachings. So there's both the practical reasons of Mormon dissent as well as ideological and theological. And this Mormon constitution was to be a bridge for the new millennium within the Council of 50, serving as rulers, a kingdom separate from the church. Again, I'll do a whole video on the Council of 50 at some point in the future. Parley P. Pratt, the famous Mormon apostle, and a committee was assigned to write, which they had lots of difficulty on. Every week they would gather, and Joseph Smith was like, "What's an update on the new Constitution?" And Parley Pratt's like, "We're working on it." It's a lot easier to critique constitutions than to write one. Finally, on April 18th, they present their draft of a constitution. Here you see it on the Joseph Smith Papers website. It begins with the words, "We the people of the kingdom of God," showing that it's appropriating constitutional principles and language for this new theocratic aim. It featured a long preamble, 3 articles, that God's law are the basis for society, that priesthood authorities must implement those laws, and that there must be fair judicial proceedings and equal justice within the land. It is long on passion and short on specifics. And in fact, that constitution never becomes fully polished. They debate it. They talk about different principles. The discussion goes round and round. It becomes circular. Eventually, after lots of discussion, Joseph Smith ends up saying, we don't need a written constitution at all. Instead, this council will serve as a constitution with God's voice going through Joseph Smith to the council, ratified, and that will be a living constitution. Now, Today, Americans often debate whether the Constitution is a living document or a concrete document, whether you need to get the originalist intent or the intent evolves with each generation. And the irony, of course, is most Latter-day Saints fall much more into the original intent camp. But Joseph Smith's constitutional principles were much more evolving. He saw a council as a living constitution, similar to the British living constitution. So this idea of a constitution evolving with society was actually quite common. And that wasn't the only thing that this radical Mormon constitution had in common with the times. On the one hand, the Mormon constitution was indeed radical. I've argued that it was one of the most radical theological and political experiments in antebellum America. But it also had a lot of commonalities. It fits within other movements. There were many in America at the time who were critiquing the Constitution of being too secular. Remember, this idea of a secular government that did not specifically reference God was a new creation. It was an experiment. And there are many who pushed for either amendments to add God to the Constitution or to replace the Constitution altogether. It also becomes a key issue during the fights over slavery, with some abolitionists denouncing the Constitution as a compact with the devil. William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist of Boston, famously burning the Constitution at public gatherings. And then when John Brown, the famous abolitionist who tries to lead a insurgency of Black insurrection, he writes a new constitution before going to Harper's Ferry. In other words, there were plenty who believed that the American Constitution was not fit to address the problems of the age, in part because it was not based on what they called at the time the higher laws of God. Now, when Joseph Smith eventually dies a couple months later in June of 1844, many saw his death at the hands of the U.S. Government failing to protect him, and confirmed to many Latter-day Saints the Constitution's flaws and the American government's flaws. They end up critiquing in the regathered Council of 50, critiquing American government as fundamentally flawed because any constitution based on the majority opinion is going to lead to mobocracy, a justifiable and understandable response given what they had gone to. And Latter-day Saints would not, again, sacralize the Constitution for quite some time. But that's a topic for, you guessed it, another video. There's a couple of lessons I think we can take from this episode. First, the Mormon desire to sacralize the Constitution, seeing that the whole thing as divine from God and perfect, is an idea that has been in flux within the tradition. We need to remember that these interpretations of the Constitution change with generations, and that Joseph Smith, even while dictating some revelations earlier on, saying that the Constitution was inspired, later on would claim that it's fundamentally flawed and needed to be replaced. And the second main lesson is that this points to some of the key tensions within both the Mormon tradition and American religion writ large, trying to reconcile a secular government based on human law, right? Vox populi, vox dei. The voice of the people is the voice of God. How do you square that with the theological principle of society being based on divine principles? And that's a paradox, a contradiction that still remains to the Latter-day Saints today, even if it's not always as pronounced. Now, I want to highlight a few excellent works if you want to learn more about that. And I have links to all of these in the description for this video. You can read the original, or at least the earliest drafts of Joseph Smith's Revelations, in which he mentions the Constitution from 1833 from the Joseph Smith Papers Project. I also strongly recommend going to read the Council of 50 minutes itself, because going to read that Constitution that was proposed in April of 1844 is just a fascinating introduction to the political milieu of the time. Now, if you want to know more about the broader context from a scholarly perspective, I wrote a whole book that was meant to explain the origins of the Constitution. It's titled Kingdom of Nauvoo, The Rise and Fall of a Religious Empire on the American Frontier. If you want a shorter and a free analysis, you can go online, and I had a article that was published in a book on the Council of 50. The article is titled The Council of 50 and the Perils of Democratic Governance. Again, link in the bio. That volume also has an article by the excellent legal scholar Nathan Oman titled We the People of the Kingdom of God, Constitution Writing in the Council of 50. I recommend that one. And then two excellent academic articles that give the broader context of Joseph Smith's academic constitutional thinking. Jordan Watkins, both of these figures were associated with the Joseph Smith Papers Project. Jordan Watkins, who wrote Slavery, Early Latter-day Saints Constitutionalism, and the Limits of the Right to Petition. Jordan Watkins is the best thinker on interpreting the Constitution history within the Latter-day Saint tradition, and this is a great introduction to that topic. And Mark Ashurst McGee, one of the best diggers and interpreters of early Mormonism, wrote Zion in America, The Origins of Mormon Constitutionalism, which unpacks those early years, up until 1833, of Joseph Smith envisioning religion within a constitutional society. Again, these are great articles that I strongly recommend. I hope this video made sense. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. Like and share the video if you found it useful, and consider becoming a member or at least subscribing for future geekery. History has never been more relevant than in the present, because we can provide background for these types of issues. As we're celebrating the U.S. Constitution today, it's important to remember that that celebration, that history, that tradition went through lots of different forms with different meanings, and it's important to understand them all.